Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hope One Live. Back in 2011, some of you may know that before I started working full-time for CrossExamined, I was doing corporate training for companies like Cisco and Bank of America. And I was doing some leadership training, and I got called in basically to a friend's office, the guy who hired me, and the HR director told me that he needed to fire me because someone in the class had discovered I had written a book called Correct, Not Politically Correct, How Same-Sex Marriage Hurts Everyone. I was fired that day, and I was later fired a week or so later by Bank of America for having written this book. Of course, I didn't bring this book up at work. Somebody just Googled my name. Someone who identified as a homosexual had Googled my name and had discovered this and said, Frank can't work here, even though he really enjoyed the leadership class I was teaching. Now, this cancel culture happened in 2011. By the way, if you want to know the more robust story, I don't have time to get into it now. Just go to our website and type in sex at work. Don't Google that. Go to crossexamined.org and you'll find the article there, Sex at Work. I explain what happened because in the name of inclusion, tolerance, and diversity, I was excluded for having a diverse view. Now, this is happening more and more in our culture today, and a gentleman has really done a wonderful service by writing a new book. His name is Rod Dreher. He's my guest today. The new book is called Live Not by Lies. Let me give it a little background on Rod. He's a real journalist, ladies and gentlemen, and he's a Christian, and he's written for the American Conservative. In fact, he writes there every day, several blogs a day, quite frequently. He's also written for the New York Post, the Dallas Morning News, National Review, many other publications. He's been on NPR, ABC News, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the BBC, and he does a wonderful blog every day. I'm on there at least a couple of times a day on the AmericanConservative.com. And this new book, Live Not by Lies, is one of the most important books of the year. In fact, it might be the most important book as we roll into 2021. So let me bring Rod on. Rod, it's wonderful having you on the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for saying such nice things about my book, Frank.
Well, Rod, you're one of the few people out there that has the courage to write a book like this. And the book, Live Not by Lies, really began with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, as you point out. Maybe explain where this phrase came from and why you wrote the book.
Sure. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was one of the most important voices, Christian heroes of the 20th century. He went to the Gulag in the Soviet Union, the prison camp system. He was sent there for getting on the wrong side of the communist authorities. While he was there, he wrote a monumental book called The Gulag Archipelago that wasn't published until, I believe, the late 60s, early 70s, in which he exposed the Soviet prison camp system. Solzhenitsyn became the leading dissident in the communist world, calling out the human rights violations and the cruelty and the executions. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, and they ended up throwing him out of the country in 1974, sent him into exile in the West because he was such a burr under the Soviet saddle. But just before he was sent into exile, he published a short essay called Live Not by Lies. It was his direction to his followers in the Soviet Union. And what he told them in the essay was basically, look, we don't have the power to overturn this government, but the one thing we can do is refuse to give them the satisfaction of thinking that we agree with them, that we will go along with the lies that support the entire Soviet system. So what he told the people to do was, whenever you're present and a lie is said, one of these lies that keep the system going, get up and walk out or do something to indicate that you don't support this. We don't have to go out into the street and get ourselves arrested necessarily, but in small ways, let us know that they may have power over us, but they're not going to do it with our consent. And that is where I got the title for this book, because I see where we're living. It's not as we're not facing anything like the Gulag Archipelago, but we are living in a system that depends on everybody being too afraid to say what they really think. And I think that the way we have to resist it is to start by refusing to assent and consent to the lies that keep our system alive.
Now, Rod, as you point out in the book, Live Not by Lies, there was a hard totalitarianism from the government in the Soviet Union. You describe the totalitarianism going on in our culture today as a soft totalitarianism. What does that mean?
Well, we can start by talking about what is totalitarianism. The simplest definition is that it is a system of government in which every single aspect of life, not just politics, but every aspect of life is politicized. The word, in fact, was invented by Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy. But when we think of totalitarianism today, we think of the Soviet Union, with Stalin and gulags, secret police, torture, that sort of thing. That's hard totalitarianism. Soft totalitarianism is the kind of totalitarianism that I think we're moving into in this country, where it doesn't come at you with from the state necessarily, and it doesn't come at you imposing fear and terror onto individuals to get them to conform. Rather, it works in softer ways. It plays on our desire for status. It plays on our desire to maintain our comfort, our security. And it says, look, if you want to go along and be part of the system and continue to keep your job, your kids get into good schools and so on and so forth, then you need to consent to the ruling ideology. So far, Frank, it's not coming from the government, though I think that's going to be right around the corner, but it's mostly being imposed on us through institutions like universities and in the media and from corporations, woke capitalism, as Tucker Carlson calls it.
And as we'll get into later, when we get into some of the solutions to this, politics is only a small part of the solution. There really isn't one political solution. It's not, if you get somebody in the White House or somebody in government, this is going to be solved. This is a cultural issue, as you point out. The corporations are actually doing this to people, as they did to me many years ago, and they're doing it a more and more robust way now. In fact, we were just talking before the show started. You had somebody tell you today that they might get fired. Can you just relate that experience without naming names?
Yeah. Just today, a friend of mine who works for a major American corporation texted me from a corporate meeting in which everybody was told that henceforth, if you're not part of our new inclusion, then you need to leave the company or you will be fired. So in order to be inclusive, they're firing people. And the particular things they were requiring of their employees would violate the conscience of this man I'm telling you about. And I'm not going to say any more details because I want to protect his confidentiality. But this is a man who's had his career at this company. And the work he does there has nothing to do with cultural politics or politics at all. But he's a traditional Christian and he can't go along with what's being asked of him. So he's going to have to turn in his resignation. How many people, Frank, out there can't afford to do that or think they can't afford to do that and are going to have to keep their heads down and and live by lies, pretend they believe what's being forced on them? I think one thing we can do as Christians is make it easier for people in our congregations or in our fellowships who are put in the position of this man. If they can know that they can count on us to help them find another job and support them and their families until they do, it'll make it easier for them to refuse to consent.
Yeah, in fact, when toward the end of the program, we'll talk about some of these solutions that we can actually and should start implementing now before it's too late. But Rod, let me ask you this. You write that under the guise of diversity, inclusivity, and equity, and a bunch of other egalitarian jargon, the left creates these powerful mechanisms for controlling thought and discourse, and they marginalize dissenters as evil. So just how do they go about doing this marginalization?
Well, one way they do it is what we were just talking about, making it possible to keep your job if you don't go along. I think one thing we're going to see coming very quickly is within different professions like law schools, medical schools, and so forth, you are going to have to consent to the full panoply of woke ideologies. Speaking specifically in medical school, you're going to have to agree to abortion or participate in abortions, and you're going to have to agree to participate in gender transition. This is what some activists are already pushing for in the medical school world, and some med schools are going for it. Similarly in law and in other professions. And if you dissent from this, then you will not be given a license. You will not be given employment. And as you found out, Frank, in 2011, it's not even a matter of bringing it into the workplace. If you use social media in any way, and you can find yourself unemployed. And it's also a matter of governing the way we use speech. We talk about speech. The mandatory pronouns, for example, these are small things, but they're really Orwellian because they control the way we frame the discourse. George Orwell in 1984 wrote about how important it was for the government to govern the language people used.
Now, Rod, you wrote Live Not by Lies. You actually had been approached by Russian dissidents, and you went and interviewed some of these dissidents. And what did you discover that they thought about America and what was happening here in America?
This is incredible. I got the idea for the book back in 2015 when a physician called me. His elderly mother had spent 4 years in a Czech communist prison camp in the 1950s when she was a young woman for practicing her Christian faith. And she immigrated to America when she got out of prison, and he was born here. But here she is in her 90s living with him and his wife, and said, "Son, the things I'm seeing happen in America today remind me of what happened in my country when communism came." Well, I thought that was really kind of out there. So I began asking around different people who, when I would meet them on my travels around the U.S., to say, what do you see here if they came from the communist world? And they all say yes. And what they see is the fear of saying what is on your mind and people fearing for their jobs. As one elderly Russian told me, that's always how it starts, when you have to worry about your employment and your livelihood, worry about it, being on the wrong side politically or culturally, it costing you your job. So after I talked to enough people in this country, immigrants from the communist world, about it, I decided to write a book, and I ended up traveling to the former Eastern Bloc nations as well as Russia and interviewing Christians, Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, who had been dissidents. Some of them even had gone to prison and were tortured for their faith. And I was asking them what their advice for us Christians in America and in the West would be. How can we identify what's coming as totalitarian? And what are some things we can do based on your experience to resist it?
Well, you dedicate the book to a Roman Catholic priest in World War II, and he had some advice, and some advice that he actually applied. What was that?
Yeah, an extraordinary story. I didn't even know about this man until I went to Slovakia to do some research. His name is Father Tomislav Kolakovic. Father Kolakovic was a Croatian priest who in 1943 was working in Zagreb, his native city, doing anti-Nazi work. He got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him, so he slipped out of the country, went to his mother's homeland, Slovakia, assumed her last name, Kolakovic, and began teaching in a Catholic university there. He told his students, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is when it's over with, the communists are going to be ruling this country. The first thing they're going to do is come after the church, and we got to be ready for it. So what Father Kolakovic did was get together small prayer groups of students, and he would bring them together to pray, but also to talk and about what was happening in the world around them and what they could do and should do as faithful Christians to resist it. And he spread these groups all throughout the country of Slovakia, and it was young people who were the main ones involved in it. The bishops, the Catholic bishops of that country told him, "Father, you're being an alarmist. You're scaring people. It's not going to be that bad." And he didn't listen to them because Father Kolakovic had studied the Soviet mindset because he wanted to do missionary work in the Soviet Union. Sure enough, Frank, the Iron Curtain falls after the Second World War is over. They kick Father Kolakovic out of the country. And the first thing the communists did, they came after the churches. But Father Kolakovic's network was able to survive, and they became the backbone of the underground church and the only meaningful resistance in that country to communism for 40 years. I dedicated my book to him because I believe that we are in 𝗦𝗘𝗗𝗦𝗢𝗕 moment here in America. We don't know when the whatever our equivalent of the Iron Curtain will be, when that's going to come down, or whether it will be more of an anaconda that slowly suffocates us. But we do know that we have the freedom now as Christians to organize and to prepare ourselves for the long run.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the pieces of advice that I think makes a lot of sense, and this comes from somebody who survived Nazism and the Soviets, and that is to get into small groups. Unpack that a little bit further for us, if you would, Rod.
The things that really surprised me, Frank, about my investigations over there is the importance of small groups in building resistance. When I was in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, a man there, a historian who had been part of the underground church in the 1980s as a college student, he took me to a house, an ordinary row house in suburban Bratislava, and we went into the basement, and he showed me a secret passage he had to move some things to find it. We went under a tunnel, under a wall, and came up in a hidden room. It was in this room for 10 years that the underground church printed prayer books and catechisms, gospels, things like that. These were all Catholics, but they printed these things with an offset printer that some evangelicals in the Netherlands had smuggled in to help the underground church. This historian told me that this went on for 10 years there, and his part of it was to be part of a small cell of college students who would come to that house every week. They didn't know what was happening in the basement. Their job was to bind the Gospels and the prayer books for distribution. What the man told me was that he was scared to death. They were all scared to death, because if they had been found out, they would have gone to prison for a long, long time. But he told me that simply being in a small group with those other young Christians gave him courage and gave him hope. These are people who couldn't go openly to church and worship openly. This man built Christian fellowship with those 3 or 4 other young men in his cell. And he said, doing that for 10 years helped me develop the courage to stand up more boldly for my faith. And when the underground church called for the first public demonstration in communist Czechoslovakia since 1968, he went, because he had built his courage up through that fellowship. I found this story repeated over and over again wherever I went. In Moscow, I talked to a man who had been sent to prison by the Soviets in the late Soviet Union, like in the late 70s, early 80s. And he said the only freedom he felt, the only time he ever felt free, was when he was gathered together in a small group with other Christians, knowing that the KGB was outside waiting for them. But it was that fellowship that made Christianity real to him. And it made me realize, too, listening to all these testimonies, that the idea that if we just go to church and we don't build these sort of close relationships with other believers, we're not going to have what it takes to make it through what's coming. We have to have those close relationships.
Gentlemen, if you're not part of a small group now, you're just part of a big church, but you don't really know people in the pews, you're more of a spectator than a active participant and worshiper, you need to get involved in a small group now. This is what Rod is saying. This is history, and history will repeat itself. And especially it'll repeat itself if we don't learn the lessons of history. We need to be engaged with other believers in a supportive network. This reminds me, Rod, of, I was in the Navy for many years, and we were actually trained in our prisoner of war school schooling called SEER School. We were trained by a guy who survived the Hanoi Hilton, which is the famous Vietnamese prison camp. And so many of those guys survived just by tapping on the cell wall next to them to have communication with another American. They had to have contact because they were kept apart. And they would come up with these elaborate tap codes and just ways of remaining in fellowship with others. That got them through 5, 6, 7 years of solitary confinement.
Do you remember Admiral James Stockdale, Frank?
Of course, Stockdale was in there. Yeah,
exactly.
As was John McCain.
Exactly.
As was this gentleman, the only enlisted guy to ever go. His name was Doug Hedgel. He got blown over the side of a ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, washed ashore, and he was taken to the Hanoi Hilton. Everyone else in there was an officer because they were aviators, so they were either pilots or naval flight officers. And when they got shot down, they were taken to that Hanoi Hilton. He was the only enlisted guy in there. And after about 2 years of being in there, they let one guy go for a PR move. And of course, the senior ranking officer there said, well, let Hedgel go. He's only 20 years old or whatever. What they didn't realize is that Hedgel had developed a photographic memory. And he had memorized every single name, social security number, phone number, address of everybody in that camp through the tap code. And then when he came home, he shared that with the authorities, and he went to everyone's house on his own dime, the next of kin. He went to everyone, some wife who didn't know whether her husband was alive or dead. He tracked her down and said, I know where your husband is. He's still alive. I just came from there. An amazing guy. But the only way they were able to maintain their sanity was to be in fellowship with other Americans. And that's the same thing you're saying, the same thing the Soviet dissidents have said, that we need to get into small groups. If we don't, we're not going to make it.
Yeah, two things about that. I recently met with a young pastor from Austin, Texas, who was traveling through my city, Baton Rouge, we just got together for a cup of coffee, and he said, thank you so much for the things you write on your blog and the things you write about Live Not by Lies. He said, it keeps me from thinking that I'm insane. It helps me to know that these things that I'm seeing happen around me in my city are really seriously bad, and that I'm not crazy for thinking so, because it seems like the whole city's trying to gaslight you. Secondly, the reason I brought up Admiral Stockdale was because Admiral Stockdale said something that I heard the dissidents, the Soviet dissidents and anti-communist dissidents tell me too. Stockdale was asked in the year 2000 about who were the people in the Hanoi Hilton, in the Vietnamese prisons, the POWs, who were the ones that survived? What did it take to survive? He goes, oh, that's pretty easy. He said the people who were optimists, they didn't make it out. They were broken. But the people who had hope, they survived. Well, the interviewer said, what's the difference? The optimists were those who thought, oh, this is going to be over by Christmas, or I'll be home in time for Easter. And then Christmas would come, Easter would come, they were still in prison, and they would be shattered. The ones who had hope, said Admiral Stockdale, were those who believed that ultimately they would prevail, but they also had the capacity to look realistically at what they were dealing with, what they were going through, and it made them resilient. I heard the same exact thing from people who had been in prison under communism. They said that there's a difference between optimism and hope. An optimist is somebody who expects the best to happen all the time. But that's just not true. All these people who fought communism, not one I talked to expected to live to see the end of communism, though thanks be to God they did. Rather, they did what they did because it was the right thing, because they wanted to serve God, and they knew that if we have to suffer, if we have to spend the rest of our lives here in prison to serve the Lord, we're able to do it because He, Jesus Christ, gives us the capacity to do it. That's the difference between hope and optimism. Christian hope, you want the best to happen, but even if the worst happens, you know that it will always have ultimate meaning if we unite our suffering to Christ.
In fact, you have a story that really stood out to me in the book Live Not by Lies, Rod. It is about a woman. I think her name is Kamala, not Kamala Harris, but a lady over, was it Czechoslovakia, who had a husband in prison? And she had a theology of suffering that most Christians in America haven't even heard of, and couldn't live it. Could you explain that story to us, unpack that story?
Sure, yeah. Camilla Bendova is just an amazing woman. She's still alive. She's quite old. She and her husband, Václav Benda, they were the only Christians in the inner circle of Czech dissidents around Václav Havel, who became the first president of a free Czechoslovakia. Well, Václav Benda, her husband, was eventually put in prison for his dissident activities, and he was given like a 4 or 5 year sentence. Left her at home with their 6 kids, and she had to try to raise them alone. At some point after 4 years, the communist authorities told Václav Benda, we'll let you out of prison and you and your family can leave for the West if you'll just sign a piece of paper saying that you give up your activities. And he wanted to do it because he was sick of prison and his poor family was suffering. Camilla bucked him up. She wrote him back and said, "Don't you dare do it. We have to prove that the things we're fighting for are real and worth suffering for. And the only way we can prove that is by staying here with our people and suffering. So I've got the home front. You're in prison. Let's keep praying and let's keep waiting." I mean, this woman has a backbone of iron.
Can you imagine that? I mean, here's a woman that could get her husband back and escape communism. And she's got 6 kids, and she says, "No, stay in prison." And she doesn't know that the Iron Curtain's going to fall shortly thereafter, right? She was ready for the long haul.
She was. And that's what I'm talking about. These people, they were real believers, and they knew that who they had to answer to. Camilla also told me, I tell this story in the book too. I was there at her apartment in Prague when there were books everywhere, just 12-foot ceiling, books on every wall. And I asked her how she got her kids through communism without losing their faith. And not only through communism, but in the post-communist period, the Czech Republic is the most atheistic country in Europe. All those kids are now adults with kids of their own, and they're all practicing Christians. And she said that, well, I read to them a lot. That was one thing I did. Like, read to them? What do you mean? She said when she would come home from work, even when her husband was in prison and she had to go to work at the university, she would always set aside 2 hours a night to read to her kids. I said, "What did you read?" She goes, "I read to them the classics. I read to them myths. And I read a lot of Tolkien." I said, "Tolkien? Why Tolkien?" She looked at me in the eye, Frank, and she said, "Because we knew that Mordor was real." And she used that story, the story of the hobbits and Frodo and all of them in this crusade against evil, to explain to her little children the kind of fight they were fighting and what their mother and father were going through and why their father was in prison and so on. I mean, it's just incredible. But it made me think too that we're not doing that with our kids. We might be telling them like, "Oh, there are these bad things in the world," and that's important. That her husband did that, told those kids what was bad about the communist system. But you can't just say what's bad. You also have to inform the moral imagination of your children about what is good, true, and beautiful. And Camilla Benedict did that.
Yeah, we don't have a theology of suffering here in America. We haven't been through anything like that. We're just coming into it now. But I'm very skeptical that we're going to get some 35-year-old tatted up, latte sipping, skinny jeans seeker pastor to give a sermon on the theology of suffering, Rod. So how do we get this message out?
Well, I tell you, in the book, I talk about the memoirs that these people wrote. Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, he was a Lutheran who went through the Romanian Gulag. He wrote a book called, I believe it's called Tortured for Christ. That was really well known in the 70s, but it's kind of fallen out of favor. It's still out there, though. I tell a story in my book about this man, Sylvester Krčméry. He was a Slovak physician, a young physician, and a member of Father Kolokovich's inner circle. Dr. Krčméry, when the secret police picked him up off the street to take him to prison in 1951, he laughed. And he talks in his memoir about why he laughed, because he knew why that they were coming for him, and he knew that he was privileged to suffer for Christ. Now, can you imagine that, with secret police having grabbed you off the street, put you in the car, taking you to the prison, laughing at that? And he went on to say that when he was in prison, he had memorized scripture for knowing this day was coming, and he knew he couldn't have a Bible there, so he drew on the scripture he had memorized. He witnessed in prison, and he told himself at the very beginning, "I am here as God's probe. I can never feel sorry for myself, because if that happens, they'll break me. Rather, let me just consider that I'm blessed to be carrying the cross of my Lord here in prison." And that's what got him through. Well, we need to familiarize ourselves, Frank, with the story of people like that, and also some of the martyrs of our own period who are coming out of Africa and the Arab world and China, the confessors, those who've suffered for the faith but haven't been killed, and also the martyrs. these are our brothers and sisters in Christ, and they have powerful stories to tell us. The age of martyrdom was not just the early church. In Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church under Bolshevism, they lost tens of thousands of people, priests, bishops, and laymen, to the Gulag and to the KGB executioners for the sake of their faith. I went in south of Moscow to a place called Butovo Field. It's a place where the KGB, in a 14-month period in the 1930s, murdered 21,000 political prisoners in the same one field, including a number of priests and bishops. Today, that place is the national monument in Russia for the victims of political violence. And there's a church built there nearby to the memory of the martyrs, the Christians who died there as martyrs. Do you know, when I went into the little rectory there with a priest who oversees the monument in the church where he lives, he came in and said that just that morning he had been at a school there in Russia just down the street from this field, talking about what happened on that field back in the 30s. The kids in that school could not even imagine that this had happened. Now, this is in Russia, 30 years after the fall of communism? It was all news to them to hear about something that had happened in their own country. And this priest, Father 𝗦𝗘𝗧𝗦𝗧, told me, because we have got to preserve this memory, not only in your country, but right here in Russia too, because if we don't remember what happened, it could happen again.
What is it with, Rod, in our country anyway, people wanting to erase our history? Why is that? Yeah. You know, they want to tear down every statue, and even people that freed the slaves, like Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And I think you may have mentioned in our previous podcast that one day they're going to tear down the statue of Martin Luther King.
Oh, yeah.
Or somebody mentioned that. Yeah. Why would anyone want to tear down a statue of Martin Luther King or Abraham Lincoln?
Well, all revolutionary regimes do this. They tear down anything about that reminds people of the previous order that existed before them, because if you maintain cultural memory, the memory of what existed before, then you have a grounds on which to resist the revolutionary regime. In Poland, when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, that totalitarian regime planned to subdue the Poles by making them forget who they were as a people, by destroying Polish history, memory of Polish history, and destroying their Christian faith. Pope John Paul II, the man who would become John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, he was a theater student back then. He couldn't pick up a rifle and go against the Wehrmacht. But instead, what he and his friends did was write plays about Polish history and about Christianity and perform them in an underground theater where anybody who went there, if they had been caught by the Gestapo, they would have been killed. But they knew it was so important to help people remember who they were. And later on, when the communists came to power, they tried to do the same thing. And in 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗓𝗦𝗢𝗧's apartment in Prague and in so many other places throughout the communist world, people would get together and to tell each other stories about who they were, because they knew that the communists wanted to erase all past history so they could, because it was easier to control people that way. In a similar way here in our society, when you see people trying to tear down statues and change the curriculum, to change the history, it's all about control. The 1619 Project that we've heard so much about, where they're trying to claim that America was founded for the sake of defending slavery. It's not true. Left-wing historians have said it's not true. But they're continuing to push this stuff in a lot of schools and in the New York Times and in the media, because it creates an ideology that allows a certain group to control others. That's why it's so important to know our history. And
you write this, and I don't know why this seems so profound to me. Maybe it's just because I'm so simple. But you said in the book that Christians cannot endorse any form of social justice that denies biblical teaching. I mean, that's just so simple and well put. What are the things in our culture now that come under the rubric of social justice that are anti-biblical, Rod?
Well, LGBT ideology is the main one right now. I think and I hope we can all agree that everybody deserves respect and nobody should ever be bullied. I mean, that is unchristian too. But we simply cannot endorse the things that we are being compelled to endorse and be faithful to Christ. And that is the number one thing right there. And when I was in Poland, Frank, last year doing interviewing for the book, I talked to Polish Catholics who told me that they felt oppressed by the American and Western European companies for which they work. They work for the Polish branch, and they were being forced to put on pride badges and celebrate LGBT pride. And they said that, this is against our religious beliefs, but we feel like we have to hold on to these jobs because there aren't good jobs over here. That's one thing. Another thing, too, is critical race theory. And this was, I think, a harder one for Christians because Christianity, of course, it's against racism. But what critical race theory does, and it's a perversion of Christianity's teaching against racism. Critical race theory says that good and evil, the line between good and evil runs between races, not as Solzhenitsyn taught us, right down the middle of every human heart, but rather between races. This has such a powerful analogy from the Soviet Union, the Soviet period. Back when the Bolsheviks took power in the Russian Revolution, they put out a statement. The head of the KGB put out a statement telling his agents to go into the countryside and kill anybody who resists the regime. He said, don't ask the individual what they've done wrong. He said, rather, look at their social class. If they're middle class or upper class, kill them. They're our enemies. If they're workers or peasants, then they're on our side. Well, we see a similar logic at work with critical race theory when it doesn't look at individuals to judge guilt or innocence. Rather, it judges guilt or innocence by people's membership in a certain race or gender category or sexual preference. So this is a way of, if we're Christians, we know that everyone is a sinner in need of redemption, and that justice is not a matter of looking at the color of somebody's skin and judging them that way, but looking at the content of their character. But so many Christians are getting tripped up by critical race theory because they quite rightly, they don't want to be racist and they want their people to be treated fairly. Critical race theory is no way to do it.
But it flips what Martin Luther King and, of course, what the Apostle Paul said, that we're all one in Christ. But Martin Luther King, as you just said we want to judge people on the content of their character, right, not the color of their skin. But critical race theory wants to flip that and judge people by the color of their skin. That's why they want to, ultimately, they're going to tear down a statue of Martin Luther King.
You got that right.
And Rod, I know the solution to this is only partly political, but I have to say this because I read it in the Democratic platform. On page 40 of the Democratic platform, they say we are not for race-neutral policies because race-neutral policies won't get the outcome that we want. So now they're going to discriminate on the basis of race. This is not biblical, and Christians should not support this. And yet that's where we are, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Rod, you mentioned this in the book. Again, the book is Live Not by Lies. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to get it. And before I read this one quote from Rod's book, we're going to go to questions soon. So if you want to type a question to Rod, just type the big word question. If you want to super chat us on YouTube, we'll try and get to that question first. Or you want to give us stars on Facebook, we'll do it there as well. Big letters, write the word question, and then we'll try and get to them here in just a minute. But Rod, you write this. It's just cultural Marxism that there's an oppressor class and there's people who are oppressed. You write, oppressors are generally white, male, heterosexual, and Christian. The oppressed are racial minorities, women, sexual minorities, and religious minorities. And then you write this in parentheses, this line here. You say, curiously, the poor are relatively low on the hierarchy of oppression. For example, a white Pentecostal man living on disability in a trailer park is an oppressor, according to this theology. A black lesbian Ivy League professor is oppressed. Now, how do they get away with this?
because they share this ideology. It is the shared ideology of elite institutions in American life. This is something that a lot of people don't appreciate, Frank, is that the power of elites to drive revolutionary ideas. In 𝗦𝗦𝗖𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗟, I talk about this well-known Polish dissident, Czesław was his name. Miłosz in the 1950s, after he defected from Poland, wrote a book called The Captive Mind, trying to explain the mind of intellectuals who surrendered to communism, to try to explain this to Westerners. And he said that the people of Eastern Europe woke up one day to realize that the people who were controlling their lives were the same people who 20, 30 years earlier were obscure elite intellectuals, working out their theories in coffee shops. And suddenly, now they were running things. Similarly, Frank, in our country, we can remember, you and I, when gender theory, the idea of transgenderism and the idea that you could change your gender, this was something that was confined to maybe the English departments at a few elite universities. And now this was endorsed and is endorsed by the Democratic nominee for president, the man who's going to be our next president, and it is endorsed by major corporations and is mandated. But it happened because of elite networks. The Christian sociologist James Davison Hunter, the man who invented the term culture wars, he said that in his book, To Change the World, that Christians don't really grasp how elite networks work, and how if an idea can't go anywhere in a society until it's taken up by elites and propagated through their network. And once it is shared by them, then that is the direction in which the society goes. Well, we're there now, even though that the elites make up, this is why they're elite, a relatively small proportion of our country. They control the means of cultural production in Hollywood, in the media, in universities, and in major corporations.
So what can we do, Rod, besides small groups? We've already talked about that. What else can Christians do to prepare for this, push back at this? Because pushing back is actually a form of love, because you're pushing back against a lie with the truth, and the truth is always what you ought to put forward. So resistance to evil is a good thing. So how do we do that?
Yeah, well, it's going to depend locally on your circumstances, but you need to prepare yourself to speak up and not consent to it. Talk to other Christians, and not only Christians, but people who may not share our faith, but who do share a commitment to free speech. I have been amazed and gratified, Frank, by people like Barry Weiss, who is a secular, liberal Jewish woman who has endorsed my book, and people like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, who some of your listeners might follow online. These are atheist liberals, but they have experienced the persecution of woke culture, and they have endorsed my book as well. There are people there who support free speech and who don't want our workplaces, our churches, our schools and institutions to become like they're run like communist cells. Find these people. We need to identify these people, and we need to stand up together. One thing that we also have to do, though, is prepare ourselves, as you and I have been talking, for suffering. The one good thing that you can do is to read these stories of the martyrs, as I said earlier, and to realize that this ideology of comfort that has taken over the American church, because we've been so free and so wealthy for so long, this is going to get burned up in the persecutions to come. There will be no such thing as cultural Christianity by the time this is over. Pope Benedict XVI, the last Catholic Pope, said in 1969, when he was just a priest, he gave a broadcast on German radio, and he said, the church is about to go through a terrible trial. It's going to lose all its wealth, its status, its power. It's going to lose a lot of people because they will not be able to stand with Christ if it's going to cost them something. But those who are left behind are going to be the people who really love Jesus and who are prepared to suffer for it. And they are going to be the seeds for the renewal of the church when the darkness passes. We're in that time right now of testing, Frank, and we need to make sure we do everything possible to prepare ourselves to be hated by the world and to even lose our jobs for the sake of Christ. And we need to prepare things in our churches for those who do lose their jobs, so they won't be alone in the world, so they know that they can rely on us to help them find work and to help feed their families when they don't have an income.
How can we protect our kids and prepare our kids?
Well, I think one of the most important things you can do is get rid of the smartphones for them. It's the most incredible thing, Frank. When I talk to pastors and youth ministers and college professors, they all say that kids come into college or in high school, they're so depressed. Some of them are addicted to pornography, and it's all about the smartphone. You know, we can't keep our kids in a total bubble. I have kids too, and they don't live in a total bubble, but you know, there are things we can do when they're really small to keep their brains from being colonized by this anti-Christian culture. And I think we can also read to our kids. We can, if you have an opportunity to homeschool them or put them at a classical Christian school, that's a great solution. We have a classical Christian school here in Baton Rouge where I live, and there are more and more of these all across the country. These kids are being taught the cultural memory of the West. I saw 2 years ago my 7th grade daughter at the time walking out to the first day of class in the spring semester with a copy of the Odyssey under her arm. They're reading all the great books of Western civilization. Now, these aren't salvation. Salvation doesn't come to us through the Odyssey, the Iliad, and things like that. But these are important for keeping our culture alive and keeping the memory of our culture alive. And look, I went through public school and public university. I never got any of that until my own children started going to a classical Christian school, and I started reading some of this stuff with them.
Live Not by Lies is the book, ladies and gentlemen. Everybody should read it. You can also listen to the interview that Rod and I had on a couple of weeks ago on our podcast. You can go to Rod's website and see he blogs there every day, 2-3 times a day. It's theamericanconservative.com, Rod, is that right?
That's it, yeah, /Dreher, Dreher. And I also have started a Substack newsletter, Frank, roddreher.substack.com. And, you know, it's been a good exercise for me. I write so often on my American Conservative blog about the quickening, the bad things that are happening in the world, because I feel like, you know, my job, my ministry, so to speak, is to wake people up, wake up my fellow believers and let them know this is what's happening. Here's what we can do. But people need more than to be alarmed. They also need to be given hope. And I've tried on my Substack blog to talk about the things that give me hope and that can give the rest of us hope too. And it's been a real exercise because it's really, really easy to find reasons to despair, but it's harder to find reasons to hope. But those reasons are there. Every one of these Christians I talk to, my God, their faces are so luminous because they saw the worst that humanity has to throw at them, and they came through it. This one man I talk about in the book, and he's maybe my favorite figure from the book, 𝗦𝗦𝗕𝗦𝗕𝗦 Okarotnikov. He was from a very prominent communist family. He came to Christ when he was 21 years old in early 1970s Moscow. By the time they threw him in prison, they really wanted to make an example of him. So they put him on death row, even though he didn't have a death sentence. He witnessed to other prisoners, and he led so many prisoners to Christ. But one night he was in solitary confinement and was really, he'd been beaten. His face to this day is still paralyzed from the beating he took. And he just began to despair of God's love and God's presence and wondering, why was he even there? The Lord sent angels to him, and he had actual visions every night in which he saw men being led one at a time to their deaths. And he could only see them from behind with their hands cuffed, led by guards. He finally understood that these were men he had witnessed to and who were executed because they were on death row, but they went to be with Christ after they died because he had been there to witness to them. That old man, he's old now, Alexander, he was crying telling me this story because this was the reason for his suffering. The Lord put him there to testify and to lead others to eternal life. I mean, when you hear a man talk like that and you realize how much he suffered and how little by comparison we have to suffer, you know that there's reason to hope, and you know there's a reason that we're going to go through this.
And you point out, Rod, that the people that went through this feel content even though they went through it, and the people that capitulated do not.
That's right.
So We have to stand strong. And by the way, the book Live Not by Lies also has a study guide. So everyone watching right now, you're going to get a part of a small group and you're going to go through the study guide on the book. Rod, where do they get the study guide before we bring Jorge in for questions?
Yeah, just type in your search engine, Live Not by Lies study guide. It should pop up on my blog. It's free. It's downloadable. I wrote it myself, or you can write to me, Rod, R-O-D, at 𝗦𝗢𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗕, AMCONMAG.com, and I'll send you the link.
Rod, great book, well needed. People need to heed it. They need to read it, heed it, because persecution's coming and we need to stand up for it. But there is long-term hope. So let's go to questions. I know we got a ton of questions in the feed of YouTube and also some from the Facebook feed. If you want to ask a question, type in block letters question and then put your question there. We'll bring Jorge on and we'll start with questions. If you want to super chat us or give us stars on Facebook, we'll try and get to your question first. So let's do that. Jorge, you there?
Hello, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this stream. I want to just let everybody know on the other side and make sure that share this stream if you care, if you think that everybody else needs to listen to this. Also, make sure that you tag people on the chat section if you can, if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you for being here, and make sure that you push this stream out there so more people can. I have a bunch of questions here, and I want to make sure that everybody gets their chance. First of all, first question that I have is from Alan Lyman. It says, how would you identify a breaking point where we as Christians should consider that our government has become untenable? As a constitutional conservative, I see the enemy in action and ready to destroy our republic.
You know, that's a question I don't know that I'm prepared to answer, because I think that the problem is not necessarily that the government has become undemocratic, but that the people themselves have been corrupted. And I can't really say, Frank, you might have a different view on this, but I'm not going to say that there needs to be a point where people actively resist the government. That day might come, but I honestly haven't thought too much about it, because I anticipate that the persecution that's going to happen is going to happen within legal bounds. You know, one thing we didn't talk about, Frank, is that the social credit system that the Chinese have.
Mention that, because that's really what's coming here more than probably government totalitarianism, although some of that may come. Mention the social credit system from China, if you will.
Yeah, I'll be real quick about it. In China today, they have what's called a social credit system, where the government gives a credit rating to each individual Chinese citizen, and it keeps a constant updated profile of each Chinese citizen based on the data the government gets from their use of smartphones, the internet, their purchases, and so on. If a Chinese citizen does something the government considers to be positive, like downloads the speeches of the leader Xi Jinping, they get a higher credit rating. If they do bad things, like go to church or hang out with people the government doesn't like, and the government can tell this because it follows GPS all the time, the algorithms are always tracing it, well, they get a lower social credit rating. If you get a lower rating, then your kids can't go to college. You can't get certain jobs. You can't go into certain restaurants and so forth. The people who are your friends and family, they have to shun you and cut you off, or they too will get a lower rating. It's genius. It's a way of forcing everybody to conform to the police state without having to send police to the front door. Here's the thing. Here in our country, big companies like Amazon, Google, and so forth, they're already collecting this data from us every single day, simply by the things we browse, the things where we go with our smartphones in our pockets and so forth. They just haven't weaponized it against us yet. If they want to do that, they can. And I think that we will live to see a time in this country when the government passes laws allowing companies to cut us off if they believe that we are threats to the civil order, we're threats to safety, to health, to inclusivity, and so forth. We're already seeing in Great Britain banks are refusing to do business, basic bank account business, with people they consider far-right extremists. Well, some of the people they're doing this to really are objectionable. But where is the line? I talked to a pastor in Nashville a couple of weeks ago, a pastor from Portland, Oregon, who said that just in the last 3 years in his city, which is on the front lines, Christians, traditional Christians, have gone from being seen as weirdos but tolerable to being downright evil. And this pastor said, what's happening here in Portland is going to spread to the entirety of the United States within a decade or so. This is the kind of thing I'm worried about more than the government oppressing us. It's big business and doing it within the law.
Yeah, the two scenarios whereby you disobey the government, according to the Bible, would be if they compel you to sin, like, for example, in China, where they say you can only have one child, and so if you're pregnant with your second child, you have to abort it. You wouldn't do that. Or if they prevent you from doing something that God has told you to do, worship God, something like that. Those are the two scenarios where you would disobey and take the penalty, take the consequences. Now, the question is, are you going to do the same thing with businesses that try and force you to either sin or to not do something that the Lord has told you to do? That's
are you
yourself.
Exactly, Frank? Are you willing to see your kids become plumbers and tradesmen instead of doctors and lawyers? Because at least as plumbers and tradesmen, they'll be able to worship God and be true to what we know to be morally true. That's a question that's going to be really difficult for middle-class Americans to face.
More questions, Jorge?
Yes, absolutely. I got this one. This is Mike Foster says, I've read your book. Now that it looks like the left are pretty much going to control our nation, where do you think we are in this soft totalitarianism? Help me, Frank.
Totalitarianism, you got
it. Totalitarianism, there you go.
Well, I think that this election that was coming up in Georgia, the state of Georgia, is really important because if the Republicans lose the Senate, that means that Joe Biden will have a unified Congress behind him. And I deeply worry about religious liberty because the left has posited that religious liberty is a bad thing for them because they see Christians who exercise religious liberty as being bigots. So this is one thing that really worries me. And I think we're also, though, going to see, whatever the government does, we're going to see an acceleration of wokeness in corporations and in universities. That's going to get more and more intense. A lot of people thought that, if you get rid of Donald Trump, then things are going to settle down. I don't think so. What we saw in Spain before the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s is an intensification on both the left and the right of this mutual hatred, because when the left got into power, they wanted to change things to keep the right from coming back into power and vice versa. I fear that we're in for that kind of cycle here in America. But I have to say that as a conservative myself, the thing that concerns me most about my fellow conservatives is that they place too much emphasis on politics as the guarantor of our Christianity. Here, so many pastors have been telling me this season, since my book came out in September, that just in the last 3 years, things have gotten especially bad in the sense of there being attacks on the faith. And this has happened with a Republican president and a Republican Senate. I'm not saying politics aren't important. They are. But what I'm saying is that all this bad stuff can happen even when we have political leaders in place who are favorable to religious liberty and other things that Christians care about, because politics is downstream from culture, and we have lost the culture. If you look back, Frank, I was just doing this today. In 1991, the numbers began to decline of people who said that they were affiliated with the church or had religious beliefs. They began a slow decline, and it really just fell off the cliff with the millennial generation. Right now, the Generation Z, which is my oldest son's generation, they're going to be the first generation in American history in which a majority say they have no church affiliation at all. Doesn't mean they're not religious, but it means that we are going the same way as Europe is, and Europe is godless today, functionally godless. All of this happened in a time when we had conservative Republican presidents, conservative Republican Congresses, and I thank God for the good things that happened under those political leaders. But it still happened. What does it profit a man to gain the White House and the Congress, but to lose his children to the faith?
Yeah, that is a big problem. As you say, I think we have to do both. We have to be somewhat politically active, obviously. Mm-hmm. But if that's all we're doing, that's not a winner. I mean, that's not going to affect your eternity as much as it will to bring up your children and to ensure that you've given them the best education possible and the best attention possible. So when they are tempted to walk away from the faith, at least it wasn't your fault, right? I mean,
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. We can't control our kids. When they get to be adults, they'll make their own decisions. But what we need to do is give them a fighting chance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me throw in a question from my friend Jim Wooden. He asked a question about the Benedict Option. That's a previous book you wrote back in 2017, Rod. Can you kind of give us a quick overview of that and how that relates to what we're talking about here?
Sure. Yeah. In fact, 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗕 can be seen as a sequel to the Benedict Option. Mm-hmm. The Benedict Option is a book. The subtitle is A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. My view is that we are a post-Christian nation in the sense that this country no longer looks to the Christian faith and the story of the Bible to explain who we are. So what does that mean for those of us who still are Christians and want to keep our kids Christian and our grandkids Christian? I believe that we need to look at America like the Roman Empire when it fell in the 6th century in Europe. St. Benedict of Nursia, a Catholic monk, he came out of the ruins of Rome and formed small communities that became monasteries to preserve the gospel within them and to build thick, resilient communities during the Dark Ages, what became a terrible time, centuries of suffering. But these monks developed a way of life that was built on the gospel and worship, and they evangelized and spread throughout Western Europe, laid the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization and of Christianity in Western Europe. I think that we need to look at that model. We're all called to be in the world. I'm not a Catholic, but we don't have to be Catholics to appreciate the wisdom there. With the Benedict Option, I think we need to see ourselves, we Christians, as having first an allegiance to the church and building small communities around schools and churches that can see ourselves as countercultural and able to thrive as this country, the mainstream, turns more and more anti-Christian. It's not a question of heading for the hills, as a lot of people thought. I don't believe we can head for the hills. We're called to be in the world. Mm-hmm. But if we're in the world, how can we not be of the world? I think, for example, of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the Old Testament. The Jews were living, as we know, in exile in Babylon, but they were completely integrated into Babylonian society. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego served the king. But when it came down to forcing them to worship an idol, they chose death before apostasy. I think we Christians today need to ask ourselves, how did they live as exiles in Babylon such that they could still do as God commanded and pray for the peace of the city and work for the common good, but at the same time know who they were? So if they got put to the ultimate test, they would not abandon God. We're called to do the same thing now. And the Benedict Option is my call to the church, whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or whatever, to figure out communities, ways of life that form these kind and disciple these kind of Christians. Kierkegaard said that Christ did not call admirers, he called followers. And you only know the difference between an admirer and a follower when it comes time to suffer.
Yep. The word Christian only appears 3 times in the New Testament, ladies and gentlemen. The word disciple appears nearly 300 times for a reason. We're supposed to be followers. Other questions, Jorge?
Yeah, I got one here from YouTube. It says, if you're planning on going back into college, person is asking, how can you not be influenced by this rising soft totalitarianism? Also, sick hair, Rod. That's what the guy said. All right.
Yeah. It's my curse. I think that the thing to do is to educate yourself. I mean, because you're not going to get it from most colleges you go to, but there are things you can do to educate yourself and to come together with other Christians to read real history, read real books, and talk about these things. And everybody has to go to college. You have to put yourself through it. In the communist years, these Christian kids would go to the university because that's the only way they could get jobs. But they also knew what the difference between truth and falsehood. 𝗦𝗢𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗍, the guy I mentioned earlier, who went to prison, Camilla was his wife who raised the kids. Benda and his colleagues in the underground would have seminars all the time simply to teach real history, real literature, things like that, to those who wanted to hear it. And Sir Roger Scruton, who died last year, an amazing man, an Englishman who risked his freedom to go over to the communist countries and help set up underground universities so people could get true educations over in those countries. We need to have that kind of entrepreneurship right now. It should happen within churches and religious groups, religious organizations. But if it doesn't, if nobody's given this to us, let's do it ourselves. I can remember, Frank, I used to be a Catholic years ago. I can remember back in the year 2000, 2001 or so, I was gathered with some other Catholic friends in our apartment in Brooklyn. And, we were all complaining about the bishops were so bad and the church wasn't teaching what it should teach. And how are we going to raise kids on this, blah, blah, blah. We had a Catholic priest there a friend of ours, who said, listen, guys, everything you're saying, it's true. The church is as compromised as you say. But here's the thing. You have the internet now. You can go on Amazon and have the greatest classics of our Christian history sent to you in a couple of days. You can organize with other Christians who see things the way you do. Come together, meet, work things out for yourself. All it takes is the inspiration and the dedication. We all listened to them, shook our head, and then we went right back to complaining. Well, we can't be those people. Whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, we have got to be entrepreneurial and dedicated, because leadership is not necessarily going to come from the institutions. I think the line between courageous and cowardly, between conformist and a dissident, is going to pass right down the middle of Christian institutions.
Mm-hmm. Frank, I got a super chat right here from Simon. He says, hey, Frank, love what you're doing. Keep up the good work. A question for Rod. What are your thoughts, and I'm trying to get this name right, on 𝗦𝗪𝗖𝗕𝗦𝗧? I have no idea who that is, but you probably do.
I don't. That's a Romanian name. Maybe he can explain who that is.
Yeah, he will have to just put it on the chat. I'll be looking out for that. I do have another question from YouTube by Fiddle Fart, and he asked the same question. That's his handle name. We read him out loud. He says, excellent discussion. Said, I was wondering if there are other resources besides your book we can get to be more informed and make preparations regarding this important topic.
Well, it's a heavy book, but Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, came out in the 50s. It is powerful. It's pretty thick and dense, but Hannah Arendt went back. She was a German Jewish refugee, and she became one of the great political theorists of the 20th century. She went back and examined Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia to find out why those people had surrendered themselves to totalitarianism. And she found so many things that are resonant here with our own situation. So I think that if you have the patience for a deep read. The Origins of Totalitarianism is a good one. Another great book, The Captive Mind by Czesław Miłosz. I mentioned it earlier. It talks about the way why intellectuals surrendered to communism. One thing, Frank, that I think that Miłosz brings up that is so important to us is he said that Americans think they misunderstand communism. They think people only go for it because they're afraid. He said that's not really true. Communism speaks to the need deep down in every human heart for harmony and meaning. It's a lie, what it says, but it's speaking to something that nobody else is talking about. I think social justice in our time and place speaks to the same sensibility. And we in the church have got to realize that we're facing a rival religion.
Yeah, here. It speaks to heaven on earth. That's really what it's all about. How can we create a utopia? And the truth of the matter is that it misdiagnoses human nature. It thinks that, that people are going to be inherently good and that they're going to work as much as they can and take as little as they need. Actually, the opposite is true. We're going to work as little as we can and take as much as we want. And so that's why Marxism and communism do not work. Socialism doesn't work, but it sounds good. It sounds like, we could all just get together and just share our resources. Everything's going to work out. But that's not the way life works. That's not the way human nature works.
There's an incredible new book, and I'm trying to think of the title of it, but the author is Carl Trueman, Trueman. It just came out. Dr. Trueman teaches at Grove City College. He is an evangelical church historian, but it's about the modern self, the creation of the modern self. This is the single best volume I can think of that explains how we got to this point historically, and there's going to be no way to figure out how to get out of this until we understand how the West got to a point where we no longer believe in God, where we think the sacred self is the center of all meaning. But Dr. Carl Trueman's new book, it's getting fantastic reviews, and I highly recommend it.
Carl Trueman. Check out, in addition to Rod's blog, theamericanconservative.com, 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗜𝗔𝗟 has a pretty robust blog as well, and he touches on these issues on occasion. 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗜𝗔𝗟 is a Catholic philosopher, and if you just type 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗜𝗔𝗟, F-E-S-E-R, you'll find him. He had a recent article on the individual as well on this, just recently. That's why it made me think of it.
Yeah.
The individual self, the deification of the self. And by the way, that's what our friend 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗦𝗧 is dealing with when she gets into progressive Christianity, when she speaks out against progressive Christianity. It's all about idealizing the self or idolizing the self. Exactly. I get to do what I want to do. I don't care what Jesus says.
Yeah.
I'm going to be a Christian and disagree with Jesus. Oh, really? Okay.
I was just trying to find Trueman's book on my iPhone. I couldn't find it. But, I mean, this is the problem right there, that we have made the sovereign self the source of all meaning, and it's even gotten into the church. There's this fantastic book that came out in 2005 about moralistic therapeutic deism. I don't know if you've heard that.
Christopher Smith, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Christian Smith at Notre Dame. And he says, Christian Smith says that this is true. This is the real American religion across denominations. It believes that God exists. He wants us to be happy. He wants us to be nice, and you only really have to call on him when you want something. And this is what people really deep down believe, no matter what they say they believe. Well, this is a pseudo-Christianity that places, again, the sovereign self at the center of all, not Christian truth, not biblical authority. And this is going to be the downfall of the church. If that's what you really believe, then of course you're going to fall prey to this soft totalitarianism, because you have nothing with which to resist it.
Got one more here. How important, Jesus Giovanni asks, how important is it for a totalitarian state to control the language of a society? And have you heard about this kind of stuff happening in Latin America as well?
You know, I haven't heard it happening in Latin America, but I wouldn't be surprised about it happening anywhere. It's hugely important. George Orwell wrote about this in 1984, because language is the way we discuss things. We have to share language so we can have discussions with each other. The way the left is compelling us to change the way we talk about gender, especially, is massive. And it's so hard to resist. When I was in Poland, I was talking to this Polish historian at the John Paul II Center in Warsaw, and he said that he sees the college students he teaches in that country as being especially vulnerable to the manipulation of language because they don't have any actual memory of, because this is the post-communist generation, they don't remember how the communists tried to corrupt language and tried to control thought by limiting the words and redefining words that were in common use so they can make them mean what the communists wanted them to mean. I think this is massive right now, and people don't even see it. It may strike us as weird when suddenly we're having to use Latinx, for example. The only people who say Latinx, from what I've read, are academics. Most Latinos don't use that language, but it is a way, if that keeps becoming common, that simple, small example, it is a way of degendering the Spanish language. And you may start to wonder, well, why are genders important in the first place? And you see where the logic leads you into believing that genders are just a human construct, not written into our God-given nature. So something as simple as putting the X there instead of an O or an A after Latin is a way of affecting the way we think about reality. And it's happening constantly. And it's so Orwellian, too, the way they talk about inclusivity as a way to exclude people.
That's right.
Right.
They talk this anti-racism, that's the big buzzword now from Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist. There is nothing more racist than anti-racism, according to Kendi, where he says that everything is racialized and everything must be judged by racial categories. There's no escaping it. It is like a totalitarian system. But now they're calling this anti-racist. You see how it works. Because if you don't agree with Kendi, then you must be a racist.
Yeah, well, that's why we're going to have to resist, Rod. And one of the things, I got two final questions for you. Here's my first final question. Some of these people have literally said that reason is racist, to actually use arguments, and reason is racist. So my first question is, as Christians and hopefully intelligent people, how does one interact with such a person who just rejects reason? Maybe it's the unanswerable question.
No, because here's the thing. I think, Frank, one of the most important cultural moments of the last decade happened in 2015 on the campus of Yale University. You can see this on YouTube if you go there. There was this big row about Halloween costumes. The university put out something saying that everybody, all the students need to be careful of not to wear offensive Halloween costumes. A professor named ภิrika Christakis, she and her husband Nicholas were headmasters of a particular residential college. ภิrika Christakis sent out a note to all the students in that particular college saying, come on, we're all adults here. What business does a university have telling us what we can and can't wear? Boom. The students raged at her. They accused her of being racist and insensitive. You can go on YouTube and see her husband, Nicholas Christakis, a baby boomer, a well-recognized professor there, having an argument on the courtyard of the college with a mob of students. And he is trying to engage them in reasonable, rational dialogue. He's listening to them, and then he's trying to get them to listen to him to have an exchange. They're not interested. They rage, they cry, they curse him really foully. And you realize these people are having a psychotic episode. Well, there is no reasoning with people like that. You can only resist them. Of course, at Yale, the administration at Yale took the side of the students. ภิrika Christakis no longer works there. Mm-hmm. So I feel that, at a certain point, you can't engage with them. And I wrote this the other day on my blog that you just don't even try because they're not open to reason. But I got a letter, a long letter. I'm going to put this up on my blog. I guess I'll do it tonight now that we're talking about it, from a Christian who said, I have to push back on that. And he said something to the effect of, you're right, they don't want to hear reason, but there are doubters within those groups who are afraid to say what their doubts are. And if they can look at you and know that you care about them and that you're not going to condemn them, they may be willing to explore those doubts with you. So this reader was simply telling me, have an open heart and an open mind. Understand what you're dealing with, that you're not going to talk these people out of what they believe in, these fanatics, but there will be those within those communities who doubt. I've had people, Frank, over the course of writing my blog, I've been writing it for 9 years now, who have emailed me and do email me every month telling me that they were atheists. As one guy said, he was a Satanist when he started reading my blog, and who have come to Christ. And they didn't do it because I'm doing apologetics on my blog. I don't do apologetics. That's not my calling. But they kept coming to see, to make fun of this crazy Christian. And they kept coming, and they kept coming and coming and coming. And I just give thanks to God for using me in that way, for not just for being somebody who is a Christian in the public square and who seemed rational and seemed like somebody that if they didn't like it first, they still wanted to listen to until eventually they came to Christ.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the ways, too, you can deal with people who don't want to engage in reason. Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine, but you don't always know who the swine are, right? Because he says that, they'll trample you to death. But I think one thing you can do is ask questions. Like, for example, on the transgender issue, when people say, well, genders are just fluid, they're just socially constructed, I might ask somebody, how can I transition to another gender if I don't even know what genders are? How could me as a man, if I say I'm a man trapped in or a woman trapped in a man's body, how could I even do a transgender to become a woman unless I have some idea of what a man is and what a woman is? And just ask the question and see what they say. So sometimes maybe not making statements, just asking questions like, transgenderism presupposes fixed genders. Otherwise, you couldn't have a transgender.
Right. You have to plant that seed of doubt, and that. Right. Important thing. You may not win the argument then and there, but if you plant the seed of doubt in the mind of your interlocutor, then you may have started something.
Or the people watching, as you said there, they're Rod. They may not even be engaged in the argument. They're just listening, or they're watching on social media. So if you would ask a question like that, maybe that'll plant a seed, and eventually. And your book, by the way, Live Not by Lies, goes into how people who get into radical individualism are never happy. They never actually come around. In fact, you have I think I read something on your blog the other day about, it was a blog about seminarians. And one of your, it was I think a Catholic seminarian who said, I just want to get out. Yeah. And he was liberal initially, and then he realized all the people that were liberal theologically and even politically, their lives were a mess. And all the conservatives had stable homes and seemed to be relatively happy, and that had an impact on them.
We had a guy at our church here in Baton Rouge a couple of years ago who showed up, a young man who's coming out of a cult. And this was an occult that practiced so-called sex magic. And he realized that he was 24 years old and he had been part of this cult. And he realized that if he was going to continue to go further in the cult, he would have to do horrible things that violated his conscience. But he said he also looked around and realized that all these people in this cult who made fun of Christians and made fun of conventional lives, they were all miserable and suicidal. And he finally realized, I have to get away from them. And because they made so much fun of Christ, and they thought that, condemning Christ and blaspheming Christ was the best thing you could do, he came to Christ.
Wow. Last question, Rod.
Frank, before we go to the last question, I want to thank CB3Amazing for the super chat, and he says the following to you. Thanks, Dr. Frank, for making the Trinity make sense.
Okay, thanks. Wow, that's high praise there, making the Trinity make sense. Well, I appreciate that. But Rod, this is a show about hope. It's called Hope One. We started it up when the pandemic started, so we want to leave people with hope. This is a heavy topic that you have in Live Not by Lies, but one that we all need to be aware of. It makes no sense to stick our head in the sand on this. It's coming. We've got to get ready for it. We've got to prepare ourselves, prepare our kids, small groups. Is one of the things we can do. But leave us with some hope. Give us some hope as we sign off here.
Frank, I end the book on this guy, 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗧, a young photographer in Slovakia that I met on my travels. He was a little boy when communism fell. He has no memory of communism. He was just a toddler. But he grew up in a Slovakia where he was much wealthier than his parents or grandparents. He's not a rich guy, but they were all poor back then. He's been able to travel internationally, practice his art of photography with total freedom. And yet he wasn't happy. A few years ago, he decided to go throughout his country and to talk to elderly Christians who had been in prison in the communist years for their faith. He was doing this as a way of paying tribute to his great-grandfather who had been imprisoned. Well, Timo said that as he went around the country and talked to these elderly people and made their pictures and did interviews with them, a lot of them were living in real poverty, but he saw in them the light of Christ, the light of happiness and peace that passes all understanding. And he said, it made me realize finally that the totalitarianism I was living in was the totalitarianism of myself, of putting myself first, of putting professional advancement, of gaining wealth. He said, I could never be secure enough or happy enough on my own. The only way I could do it was to put Christ first in a real way. He said that these people who survived real totalitarianism, hard totalitarianism, they gave me the key to my prison cell to let myself out, the prison cell of radical individualism and materialism. So I think this is the hope right there. You know, we may never in this country, Frank, live, and I hope we never live like those people under communism had to live, where they were impoverished, had to fear for their lives every time they walked out in the street. But that doesn't mean that we're going to escape totalitarianism. We can always escape, though, through Christ. And it's not just nice words. The stories of these people who had to suffer for him, and some of them even say, Frank, that the best time of their life was when they were in prison, because that's when everything was stripped away and there was only the Lord there in front of them. I think that it's something I hope that you and I never have to go through. Or, hey, I don't know about him, but I hope none of us have to go through that. But if we do, we can be sure, because of the testimony of these witnesses, some of whom are still alive today, that this can be one of the greatest, most glorious things that could ever happen to us. And that is our hope. Our hope is always in that no matter how much we suffer, if we unite our suffering to Christ and give him glory, no matter what happens to us, that in the end, he will triumph through us, through our fidelity.
Amen to that. Thank you, Rod. Again, the website is theamericanconservative.com. You'll see Rod there every day posting. Also, the book is called Live Not by Lies, and you can get a study guide that goes with it. I highly recommend you get that and go through that study guide. There it is, Live Not by Lies.
There it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Or mine's on Kindle, so I can't hold it up. I also want to point out, those of you who are watching, that on the podcast this coming week, we will have on Dan Kimball and his new book, How Not to Read the Bible. It goes through some of the most difficult questions of the Bible, some of the violence passages, slavery, anti-science supposed passages, those kind of things. So tune in for the podcast next time. And go back a couple of weeks ago and listen to the interview with that Rod and I did on his book, Live Not by Lies. So thanks, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Rod. See you guys here next time. God bless.
Thanks, everybody. God bless.